So this is my Indigenous lands assignment. So the first town I'm going to talk about is Huntsville, Muskoka. So Huntsville, Muskoka is where I spent most of my childhood. I had a trailer in Huntsville, and I spent most of my summers swimming on the lake, hanging out with my friends, and just making a lot of memories. And it really shaped me to be who I am today because of all the memories I had there. And that was one of the places that I enjoyed visiting as a child, and it really was a retreat for me, and it's a beautiful place I love to visit. So here's a picture of the Lake Vernon, more of the lake over here in the forest. Just a gorgeous picture, and this is in the town Huntsville. So the Indigenous nation Huntsville is located on is the Anishinaabe territory, which included the Ojibwe, the Chippewa, and the Algonquin people. The lake my cottage was located on was called Lake Vernon, and often the Anishinaabe crossed through Doe Lake and Lake Vernon throughout Huntsville to travel. Doe Lake periodically served as the trading station in the fur trade. The territory is covered by the Williams Treaty of 1923 and the J. Collins Land Purchase of 1785. The Williams Treaty in 1923 included the Chippewas and the Mississaugas, which they signed the Williams Treaties, and over 90 years later, the Williams Treaties First Nation have joined to ensure they are provided their rights and the relationship with the land is respected. The Williams Treaty were signed in October and November of 1923 by the Government of Canada and Ontario, and also by 7 First Nations of the Chippewa and Lake Simcoe and the Mississauga of the North Shore of Lake Ontario. And the important event that took place in Huntsville, Muskoka was the fur trade on Lake Doe through Lake Vernon as well. So the next place is Toronto. Toronto has been a huge part of my life ever since I can remember. I grew up just outside of Toronto, so I spent most of my weekends there. I enjoyed spending a lot of time there with my family and friends, and I went to concerts there. It was just, going there was a big treat, so it became a part of me, and I really enjoy visiting there to this day. So here's a picture of downtown, this Toronto sign, the CN Tower. So the Indigenous nation Toronto is located on is the Mississauga territory. The land was purchased from the Mississaugas by the British Crown in a deal later known as the Toronto Purchase. But on June 9th, the Mississaugas of New Credit and their chief... Oh, sorry. Actually, I'm going to talk about that after because that's an important event. But the treaty was the Mississauga Purchase Treaties. In a document I found online between the Mississauga, which was the Anishinaabe, and the Crown regarding the land currently occupied by Mississauga, documents found between 1805 and 1806. There were 5 Mississauga Purchase Treaties. One of them is detailed like this. So it took place on August 2nd, 1805, and the purpose of it was an agreement to surrender land in consideration of £1,000 currency in goods valued when delivered, reassuring for the Mississaugas certain fisheries, flats, and low grounds for camps and cultivated lands, and 1 mile each side of river credit. And the land involved was 70,784 acres west of the Toronto Purchase of 1787 and the north of Lake Ontario and Peel and Halton countries. And an interesting event that took place in Toronto was on June 9th, the Mississaugas of New Credit and their chief Brian Laforne visited Toronto to meet with Mayor David Miller and City Council to celebrate a deal with the federal government to compensate the Mississaugas $145 million for the original sale of the land that is now Toronto, a deal which is referred to as the Toronto Purchase. Skipping on next to the next area in Canada, this is Nova Scotia, so some beautiful photos of Nova Scotia and one of the towns. Nova Scotia is a big part of my childhood and of who I am today because my aunt lives in Nova Scotia, and I often spent a lot of my summers there and a lot of my time there visiting, and it became a really important part of my life, and I love visiting to this day. It's absolutely stunning, so I decided to choose this. The Indigenous nation Nova Scotia is located on is the Mi'kmaq. The Mi'kmaq group are the founding people of the province and still remain the prominent Aboriginal group within Nova Scotia. When the Mi'kmaq people first encountered the Europeans back in the 16th and 17th centuries, the territory stretched from the southern portions of the Gaspé Peninsula eastward to what is modern-day New Brunswick and all of Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island. And it's also divided into 7 smaller territories, but we're going to focus on the Annapolis Valley First Nations, which is the one I'm familiar with because my aunt lives in Annapolis Valley. The treaty that happened in Nova Scotia was the Treaty of 1752, which was signed by John Baptiste Cobe and is described as the chief sachem of the Mi'kmaq inhabiting the eastern part of Nova Scotia, and Governor Hobson of Nova Scotia made peace and promised hunting, fishing, and trading rights. And an important event is in 1610, Henry Membertou, a Mi'kmaq chief, became the first Indigenous person to be baptized as a Catholic in New France, beginning a pattern of intense conversion and intermingling of customs. Mi'kmaq people who had readily adapted to European trade goods were likewise receptive to religious practices. And the last one is North Bay. North Bay is important to me because as a teenager I spent a lot of my weekends here visiting with my friend. Her grandmother had a cottage here, so I spent a lot of time there, and it's just a really beautiful place to visit, and I really enjoyed visiting it, and it created a lot of memories for me. So the Indigenous nation North Bay is located on is the Nipissing Territory. The Nipissing First Nation consists of historic First Nation band governments of Ojibwe and Algonquin descent who have been living in the area of Lake Nipissing in Ontario for hundreds of years. The treaty in North Bay is in 1850, the Nipissing signed the Robinson-Huron Treaty with the Canadian representatives of the British Crown. In the face of increasing European engrossment by settlers, they wanted to confirm their claim to the north shores of Lake Nipissing and its main waterways. An important event that took place in this territory, the Nipissing controlled trade routes that became increasingly desirable during the early French colonial period, as the French proved a huge market for the inland pelts, exporting many to Europe. The Iroquois conducted military campaigns against the competing Huron and Nipissing in the competition for furs. By 1647, the Nipissing regrouped to the Lake Nipissing area. By 1671, the Nipissing had been reported moving back to Lake Nipissing. So yes, that is, and here's my resources. So that is the end of my presentation, and thank you.